All right, let's jump into the material. We are now focusing on 2023 and looking ahead. And I must say that we have a lot of material to cover, and and I think it's important to understand that what we know is a drop and what we don't know is an ocean. Isaac Newton said that, who apparently knew a lot, but the point is that there is a huge amount of information out there. The universe is very large, and although we can use an astrological filter to look at the year ahead, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're gonna know everything about the year ahead. In fact, we can't. That's one of the magical things about astrology, is the fact that even though it gives us an edge to understand what's coming up, it does not answer all of our questions. So when we look ahead for, like to a year, there's many different ways to do it. And some of the things that we look at are the movement of the outer planets. We look at the major outer planet aspects. We look at eclipses. We look at Mercury retrogrades and all the retrogrades for that matter, because all the outer planets go retrograde every year for about 5 months. Excuse me. They, in my mind, are less important when we're looking at a year in its entirety than the Mercury retrogrades, and if Venus or Mars go retrograde that year, because Venus and Mars do not go retrograde every year. Those become important, and we do have a Venus retrograde coming up in 2023, and we'll get there in a moment. One of the important things that occurs with respect to the moon is that the nodal axis, the north and south nodes of the moon, as you probably all know, move in a retrograde fashion. They have been in the axis of Taurus to Scorpio, and the nodes will shift from Taurus, Scorpio back into Aries and Libra. That occurs on July 17th. That also occurs right around the time that it will be squared by Pluto, moving back and forth from Capricorn into Aquarius and then back into Capricorn. We'll get to that in a little bit, but I think that's an important piece of the year itself. Whereas the shift from the nodes may go from resources into an area that's more focused on relationships and relationship issues. The thing that when we look at eclipses, also, they typically, well, they have to follow the nodal axis, because an eclipse only occurs when there's a new moon or full moon within reach of close proximity to the north or south node. And so we can see just very quickly, looking at the eclipses for 2023, that they are in either Aries, the Aries Libra axis, or in the Scorpio Taurus axis, which is where the lunar nodes are moving through. So let's take a look at these. And I have to say that although most astrologers look at eclipses, and as some of you for looking at the meaning of a year ahead, and as many of you know, I co-authored 8 years of Your Year Ahead, Your Astrology Guide to the Year Ahead for Barnes & Noble back in 2006 to 2013. I'm not convinced that eclipses really tell us as much as we would like to think that they do. However, we're going to start off looking at the 4 eclipses. We'll go through them pretty quickly, but they do have a story to tell. And the first eclipse of the year, and I'm going to move me to the other side of the screen so that, and make me smaller so that I don't stand on the fact that this is a hybrid solar eclipse. Hybrid solar eclipses are very rare. What it means that it is total in some places and then is actually, even on the eclipse line, it turns into a partial or annular eclipse in other places. So it's not a full total eclipse, but it is an important eclipse, mostly because the eclipse is occurring at the very last degree of Aries. Um, I find the eclipses have to do with a bit of instability. And it's important here to note that Pluto has, in March, will change signs where it's been for a couple of decades nearly in the sign of Capricorn, where so much action has occurred, including the Saturn Pluto conjunction back in January of 2020, which was within 24 hours of the first announced COVID mortality and the Wuhan lab announcement of the COVID genome. That was in January of 2020. And then we had 3 Jupiter conjunctions to Pluto in 2020. Also in Capricorn, the South Node was moving at that point in time, also through Capricorn. And so the idea is that the shift of Pluto from Capricorn into Aquarius is a big deal. But what's really intriguing is that this eclipse is kind of it's squaring Pluto, but it's a new moon eclipse, and it's within a half a degree of Pluto, but it's actually kind of a, even though it's in Aries, it's still a throwback because it's right at that point of squaring the Capricorn to Aquarius. And so I think that this eclipse is really about, it's about a shift. It's about a major shift. And I think in some ways it emphasizes that shift, especially with Chiron and Jupiter also in Aries. And these Aries planets, in particular Chiron, are being squared by Mars, Mars in Capricorn, having finally moved out of its shadow by the end of March, out of Gemini and into Cancer. I don't have a lot more to say about this eclipse other than the fact that it is square Pluto, and we can expect the continuing upheaval of the old versus the new. And for a couple of years, we were working as the old being Saturn and the new being Uranus as they moved through their square. But that square is pretty much done. And now we're getting this eclipse squaring Pluto. And so I think this is a little bit of a harbinger of the future. And yet at the same time, it's still not quite there because it's ready to jump into the new area, but it's at that last degree of Aries. I find this very, very interesting. The next thing that we want to look at is the next eclipse, which is an appulse eclipse, which is like a partial. In effect, it's like an eclipse with the moon a little bit further away from the Earth. And this eclipse, being a full moon in Scorpio, we still have in May, we still have the north and south nodes in Scorpio and Taurus. And so this eclipse, though, is noted not like the previous one for its square with Pluto. This one is noted for its conjunction opposition to Uranus. The full moon is opposed Uranus, and Uranus is being conjoined by the sun over the next few days, within 4 days after 4 days after this eclipse. And this eclipse denotes change. This is really about reaching a point in whatever solid places we felt we stood, and it is actually moving into something new, and that Uranus denotes that there can be some real suddenness here. Remember, lunar eclipses are often a reference to the past and what we're leaving behind. And so I think it's important to note that the first pair of eclipses, the first one is emphasizing Pluto, and the second one is emphasizing Uranus. As we get to the next pair of eclipses, again, they are in the Aries Libra axis. The new moon eclipse, which is an annular eclipse. I had the pleasure of seeing an annular solar eclipse in Singapore the day after Christmas, on Boxing Day in 2019, just before COVID began shutting down, and I ran from Asia back to the United States because everything was closing a couple months later in early February. But an annular eclipse is when the moon in its natural orbit is toward its apogee, meaning it's farther away from the Earth than normal, which means that as it goes across the sun, it doesn't cover the entire sun. There's a ring around it, and it's not just the corona ring that you see during a real total eclipse. It's actually a ring that actually leaves the sky not completely nighttime dark. It doesn't get 100% dark like a total eclipse does. But this annular solar eclipse being a new moon in Libra, and it being conjoining Mercury, has this whole element of communication. Note how close the Mercury opposition is to Chiron. So we can see some dealing with old wounds here. This is a south node eclipse. Again, even though it's a solar eclipse, which often has to do with change of power structure or a change of authority, the fact is that it's a south node eclipse, so it's also referring to the past. We see that Mars has moved all the way into Scorpio by this time. But I think the important thing here to note that this is a relationship-oriented eclipse, and it denotes, to me, a potential for healing. Also, we have Mars trining Saturn, which I think denotes some stability here, and I think that's important because there's going to be a lot of change next year, but the change is not on any level as profound as the changes from 2020 to 2022 were, at least in my opinion. We will see as it unfolds. All right. You would like to see the window on the left bigger. Joanne, I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure what you're saying there. You see two screens. I don't know how you see two screens. Does everyone see two screens? That's let me just check here. No, I think that might be yeah, you might have to check your view and see how you have your view set up. But I'm not of more help there. I'm sorry. I don't know the answer. Let's just see. Yeah. Yeah, we should be okay. All right. The thing, what we missed one eclipse here. We have the partial lunar eclipse, and this is on October 28th. And this eclipse is a different flavor than the other eclipses. It's still in the Scorpio-Taurus axis, but note that the nodal axis has, in this one and the prior one, has shifted back to the Aries and Aries and Libra. So the thing here is about this eclipse is that what's highlighted to me is Jupiter and Mars. And the reason for that is that in this eclipse, the moon is coming in to a conjunction with Jupiter, and into an opposition with Mercury and an opposition to Mars. And so we have this incredible energy here of the value that we place on our own selves and the Taurus, what we have, our possessions, the things that we need to bring into our own life. And of course, what comes to my mind is the idea that with the moon conjoining Jupiter in Taurus, there's this whole idea of having to take care of ourselves in order to be able to take care of others. The Taurus-Scorpio axis is one of simplicity versus complexity. I think it's important here to also note that that Venus and Neptune are both at difficult points for this eclipse, because Venus on one side is forming a half square, a semi-square, or an octile, with the planets in Scorpio, and in particular the Sun, and it's forming a trioctile, 3/8 of a circle, or a sesqui-square, or a square and a half, with the moon side of this, creating a little bit of stress. And what's interesting is that on the other side, we have Neptune in that same role, forming a half square to, in effect, the Taurus side. Here it's to Jupiter, and a square and a half to the Scorpio side, which is the Mercury and Mars. And so this is not a relaxing eclipse in any way, but it does denote growth. And I think that this will kind of have a lot of impact as the year progresses, as we move toward the end of the year. All right. I can't keep up with the questions. Let's see. Neptune Saturn conjunction is not until 2024, but that is certainly going to be an important conjunction as Saturn comes into Neptune. And yes, we'll talk about the Venus retrogrades, what some people call the Venus star point. Yeah, let's see if we can address the um, and yes, the slides will be available both as a presentation on YouTube, and also if you would actually like a copy of the slide deck itself, I will make that available to everyone, and I will make sure that you all get the URL for downloading the actual PDF file of these slides themselves. Okay, so let's move on. And the next thing I want to talk about is Pluto's stations and its ingress. And I need to take a short detour here into the concept of the age of Aquarius. Ages have to do with the shifting of the poles. Excuse me. Ages have to do with the shifting of the poles and have nothing at all to do with the movement of the planets. The fact is that there may be resonance from one to the other, but Pluto's movement into Aquarius, or even the 1962 alignment of the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, all in the sign of Aquarius in February of 1962. These are not about the age of Aquarius. These are about planets moving through signs, and they certainly emphasize the sign, as does Pluto moving into Aquarius. But remember, ages are 2,200 years long, and it's most likely that the age of Pisces, which is sometimes referred to as the age of Christianity, it's most likely that it began around the time of the birth or crucifixion of Jesus. And if that's the case, then the age of Aquarius is still a good 100 to 200 years off. Now, the fact of the matter is no one knows when an age starts, because we're looking at a 25,000 year cycle, and there is no exact starting point that's ever been measured. I mean, in effect, we've made all these lines up. And so it's important to know that those people who say we've entered the age of Aquarius are probably off by a good century. However, when we're talking about a shift that occurs over changing of the ages over 2,200 years, well, then it's likely that the cusp will be at least 100 years on either side. And so it's certainly, what's the right word, arguable that we are feeling the tinges of the age of Aquarius, but I would argue that we are not there. And I would also argue that a lot of the quote unquote new age thinking around the age of Aquarius is about how wonderful it is and how there'll be equality and gender equality, and that the power structures will, kind of dissipate, and that everyone will be, happy as we move out of this, kind of the end of so what some people call the Kali Yuga, the large age of the Iron Age, and the heaviness of these times into something that is more freeing conceptually, Aquarius being an air sign. And I have a one-word answer to anyone who goes off into these places of unicorns and rainbows, and that is, and of course you have to know a little bit about the older Star Trek in order to get this, but the answer is Borg. Now, for those of you who know, Borg was a race that was encountered in Star Trek, and it was a very intelligent race, but it was insectoid, meaning that there was no individuality. The line that if someone said, "Who are you?" to a Borg, they would respond, "We are Borg. We shall assimilate you." And if you want to know what a society of absolute Aquarian equality looks like, just look at an ant colony or a bee colony or a termite colony. And so it's not all, like I said, unicorns and rainbows. It's just a little bit of the shadow side of Aquarius that we also need to think about. Now, having said that, nevertheless, it is extremely important that 2023 as a transition year dips its toe into the pond of, or maybe ocean of Aquarius. Now, Aquarius is a pretty misunderstood sign. Yes, it's an air sign, but it's the water bearer. And what does that mean? It means this. It means that there is moisture in the air, and without moisture in the air, there can be no communication. That when you go to an area that is incredibly cold and dry, for example, there's a restraint of energy on an emotional or psychic level that is like anyone who's lived in a northern climate or a very dry climate knows that when you go to shake someone's hand, you go quickly, because if you go slow, you get an electrical shock. Or when you go to turn on a light, the same thing, because you build up a charge and it doesn't flow easily, and then it has to release. Whereas if you live in a warm, moist climate, tropical areas that are moist, you can't get a shock ever because the energy is always flowing. Now, the symbol of Aquarius being those waves like in the air are representative of electricity. And of course, Uranus being the modern ruler of Aquarius, we understand its connection to electricity. But here's the thing. The nervous system in the body needs water. It can't work without it being wet, because the wetness allows the electrical impulse to be conducted. And so Aquarius, even though it's an air sign, it's the water bearer, so that communication can occur on a perhaps even psychic or intuitive level. I do believe that what we're seeing going on right now in the area of AI, chat GPT, and other chat platforms or other artificial intelligence platforms are going to change things as much as the internet did back in the early 90s. That's how big this threshold is that we are on. And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole right now. I will in one of my YouTube talks, because it's so important that Aquarius in many ways is going to be the step into artificial intelligence. Yeah, quantum computing and other things, but this whole artificial intelligence thing is that we have reached a point in evolution where the external world will be smarter than the internal world. That artificial intelligence will be smarter than we are individually. Right now, it's just a collection of facts, but it will be able to put those facts together. And again, I think this is the big shift of Pluto going into Aquarius. There are many other things. We'll get a taste of it in 2023 when Pluto directs into Aquarius. on March 23rd. It stations on May 1st, and then it goes back into Capricorn on June 11th, turns direct in October. It moves back into Aquarius next February, in February of 24, and it stays there for then a couple of decades. And so this is really like an early warning, like a, what do we call it in theater? It's foreshadowing, and we will get a taste of what's going on. And also, it's important to note, and I mentioned this earlier, that that Pluto will actually square the nodes 3 times on July 22nd, 25th, and 28th. So we're really looking at the entire end of July into the beginning of August, because of the wobble of the true node. That node will go back and forth across Pluto, and at that time, Pluto will have moved back into Capricorn. So this is going to be a very dynamic period of time for sure. All right. Let's go on and take a look at Saturn. We're skipping over Uranus and Neptune here because they don't change signs. And in fact, Pluto and Saturn and Jupiter do. It's unusual to have 3 outer planets change signs. Well, Jupiter changes signs pretty much every year, but to have Saturn and Pluto changing signs, I think, is quite significant. And the fact that Saturn is not just leaving Aquarius and moving into Pisces, but Saturn is, and where it's been for 2+ years, but Saturn is leaving about 5 years of being in a home sign. Because remember, traditionally, Saturn rules both Capricorn and Aquarius. Aquarius and Capricorn are domiciles for Saturn. So Saturn has been at home and strong. And when it moves into Pisces, it's a bit of being like a fish out of water, or maybe a goat in water. And keep in mind here that the goat in water is the dolphin. I mean, the meaning of Capricorn as the goat and the mountain goat and the sea goat. The sea goat is the dolphin. And I think here we can see more intuition coming into play. We can see hopefully more compassion. The problem, the shadow side of Saturn and Pisces, is the delusion. I mean, this is a Jupiter-Neptune ruled sign, and therefore Saturn can be very authoritative in its own delusion in Pisces. I think it's important for us to stay aware of that. Obviously, with Neptune having been in Pisces already for over a decade, this is an important issue. And yes, someone mentioned that Saturn will catch up to Neptune. That occurs in 2024. And the thing about Saturn lining up with Neptune, it is that it's usually a reality check, and it's an important reality check. By the way, as Saturn moves through the end of Aquarius and into Pisces, it will semi-square Chiron from both sides, and it'll do that 3 times. It'll do that at the end of February 23rd, and then it'll do it again on the other side. It'll semi-square Chiron on August 14th, and then again on November 25th. And when Saturn and Chiron run into each other, there's often hard lessons to learn. Remember, Chiron we normally think of as the wounded healer, but its most important trait is not that it was wounded, it's that it was a healer. In fact, it was also a teacher. Chiron mythologically was the first mentor. Chiron taught Asclepius, Hercules, a host of other mythological dignitaries. And so we have something to learn when Chiron hits that semi-square, when Saturn hits that semi-square to Chiron. And the learning may not be all that easy because it is a semi-square or half square. Okay, moving on, we get to Jupiter. And Jupiter is in kind of a weird phase. You know, I'm reminded that about every dozen years, As many of you know, I have Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and the North Node in Aries. And it seems like every time Jupiter comes around to Aries, it just whizzes through the sign like, hey, wait, give me a retrograde, give me some time to ingest this, give me some time to work with it. But no, for whatever reason, when Jupiter moves through Aries, it often does this weird thing like it's doing now. And that is, it touched into Aries last year in 2022, retrograded back into Pisces, and it then moved into Aries in December of 2022. And by May, it's out of Aries. So we only have Jupiter moving through all 30 degrees of Aries in 5 months because it's getting it right at that direct sweep. And it's very abrupt and sudden, like Aries can be. And yet with Jupiter in Aries, it seems like we have this potential for making something into something good. There's this kind of, we're ready to say yes to the deal before we know what the deal is. An opportunity comes by and impulsively we want to take it before we know what the opportunity is. The upside of Jupiter in Aries is that it's fiery and it's engaging. And I think we're seeing this already. But by May, Jupiter will move into Taurus, where it will turn retrograde mid-Taurus, and it will back up all the way to 5 degrees of Taurus by the end of the year. So from May all the way through 2024, Jupiter will be in Taurus. Jupiter in Taurus has a little bit of a harder time. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, Jupiter is expansive, and Jupiter is growth, and Jupiter is opportunity, and Jupiter is movement. And Taurus likes the status quo. Taurus likes things the way they are. And yet, with Jupiter in Taurus, when we pick the direction that we want to move in, nothing will stop us. There's that sense of sheer determination and kind of an unrelenting push towards whatever, drive towards whatever it is. When Jupiter moves into Taurus, we're no longer distracted by every good thing that we can imagine, which we are while Jupiter is in Aries. And so Jupiter in Taurus is harder to grasp onto and do something with. But once we do, it's much easier to ride that to culmination and to get something out of it. Okay. Moving on. Oh my God, we got a pile of questions here that it's okay. The question is the water bearer masculine or feminine? Well, first of all, we have to be careful about masculine and feminine because a part of the larger shift that is going on, which may be an Aquarian oriented or Uranian oriented shift. And that is this whole thing of gender bending or gender equality, or maybe even sidestepping the issue of gender on some level. Now, traditionally, Aquarius is a masculine or positive polarity because you start at Aries, and Aries is and these are just, think of them as electrical charges or yin and yang. Aries yang, Taurus yin, Gemini yang. And it turns out that the fire and air are all yang or quote unquote masculine, and the earth and water are all feminine. And there's something here that goes back to the Greek that I cover extensively in the foundations course in level 1, I think it is, that the old Platonic Plato basically talked about how the elemental division was so important because fire and air were aspiring and upward moving, and this is spirit. This is a masculine energy, and they are spirit. whereas the water and earth are soul, and that's downward, inward moving. Soul is spirit encapsulated in a body. And then spirit moves upward, soul moves downward, inward. And so, yeah, Aquarius is a masculine, positive, yang, or spirit oriented sign. Okay. Moving on. So we got the Jupiter thing. We got the Jupiter thing wired. Now, I want to just run through these pretty quickly. You'll have the slides on these. We normally, when we're looking at a year ahead, we look at what the outer planets are doing aspect wise. And after 2020, 2021, 2022, when Saturn and Uranus and even Jupiter and Neptune all made important aspects. I mean, we had the Jupiter to Pluto and the Saturn to Pluto, and then the Saturn to Uranus. All of these are incredibly powerful outer planet transitions. 2023 has none of them. There's basically no aspects, that traditional aspects created between Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And so we go back to Jupiter, which are more numerous, but they're basically the largest things we can grab onto, which says something in itself about 2023. And so I'm going to just run through these pretty quickly. You'll have the slides to talk about them. And obviously, as the year unfolds in my monthly forecast each month, we'll be digging into these further. March 11th, Jupiter conjoins Chiron, healing opportunities. I'm just throwing some of the words together. I don't want to say too much about them because I don't want to limit what possibly can happen, especially with Jupiter, where it is about potential. Although by the end of March, March 21st, it's semi-square to Saturn, half square to Saturn, is important because remember, there was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in December of 2020. In fact, this was a great conjunction, meaning it was a once every 4-century conjunction where the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn changes elements. It had been in Earth, and now it's moving into air. And this particular semi-square is the first test of that conjunction. Jupiter expansive, Saturn contractive, and we have a little bit of balancing to do here. By 2020, by May 17th in 2023, Jupiter squares Pluto, and this is at just as after it has moved into Taurus. This is a fixed square. Remember, the 3 flare-ups of the COVID that occurred in 2020 all occurred while Jupiter was conjoining Pluto. Now, does this mean there'll be some sort of throwback there? I don't know, but we'll watch, because Jupiter expands Pluto, which is the underworld. It brings things up. And here it can be more conflictive, but I think that'll be an important aspect to watch. June 19th, Jupiter sextile Saturn. Now these opposites, these cosmic regulators, if you will, are working in tandem. There's an opportunity here to grow Saturn by restraining, to grow Jupiter by restraining Saturn. This growth, expansion, contraction, restraint kind of work well together so that we actually can get some solidity toward what we're working on. Then by July 22nd, Jupiter semi-squares Neptune. It will do that again on November 5th. This is a bit of space cadet stuff. I mean, Jupiter is expansive, Neptune is expansive. Those of you who followed my teachings know that I think that Neptune is simply Jupiter in drag, or maybe it's Jupiter escaped from Dad. You see, Jupiter is expansive, but it can't expand beyond the limits of contractive Saturn. Saturn is like authority or Dad or the rules or the regulations. It's the constrictions that we live within, and Jupiter can't break out of that. Jupiter is expansive, but only as expansive to reaching its limit in Saturn. Neptune is expansive forever. Neptune doesn't have to answer to Saturn. Neptune is the dreams and the imagination and the just making shit up. We can go wherever we want with Neptune. There are no restraints on it. And so I see this November 5th semi-square and the July 22nd. The second one is on the retrograde. I see these as basically growth, expansive, imaginative, dreamy, and we will see where they lead. With the Mars stuff, I'm going to breeze through this even quicker. The important thing to understand about Mars, especially where we are right now, is that we are coming out of a Mars retrograde. But the fact is that Mars travels through 11 signs in about a year or so. And then it spends about 8 months in one sign. Mars has been in Gemini since, well, it turned retrograde in Gemini in the end of October. I think it moved into Gemini back in September, October, November, December, January, February, and March. It doesn't move into Cancer until the end of March. And so we have this forever thing of Mars holding the energy back. And I want to say a few words about this because this is, I think, an important piece to understand 2023. In 2023, we're coming off of maybe the most extraordinary run of aspects that we will ever live through. Maybe until 2026, there's another run. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But between the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction and the Saturn-Uranus square, and the great conjunction, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and the fact that Saturn was in its domicile as it was making this conjunction to Pluto back in 2020. The last time that happened was within a couple of months of Martin Luther nailing the theses on the church wall, which kicked off the Protestant Reformation. So these changes have been huge over the past couple of years. We're moving into new territory now, but it's like we're not allowed to feel like we're actually there, because Mercury is in this little retrograde loop. Okay, it's turned direct at the time of this presentation, but it'll be until February until Mercury is out of its repeat zone, its shadow, what Gemini Brett calls its retroshade. You know, it's that area where it goes through, forward, back, and forward again. And so we're not yet moving into new territory with Mercury. And also the same is true with Mars. And because Mars is retrograde lasts so much longer, even though Mars is now turned direct, Mars will be moving through territory where it's already been through twice, both direct and retrograde. It'll be moving through that same territory again until the end of March. When Mars moves into Cancer on the 25th, that will be like the Mars is finally moving forward, but it moves into Cancer where it doesn't feel like it's moving forward at all, because remember, the crab moves backwards. And so even as Mars moves into Cancer, we're still holding on to old stuff, holding on to the past, holding on to information that we believed was true, even though we may be presented with the truth. We're not quite ready to release our Cancerian crab-like pinchers on what we've been holding on to. And so this idea that 2023 has begun, it's really only begun as a number. It's really not going to begin until the new moon, in Aries. That once we get past this March change of both Saturn moving out of Aquarius into Pisces and Pluto moving out of Capricorn into Aquarius, and Mars moving out of its shadow, then we're going to feel like, wow, the future is finally here. Let's go. Let's run with it. Let's go somewhere. But until then, we're kind of in this, kind of like in this Groundhog Day place of where where we are being run through the same thing again and again and again and again. Mars is squared to Neptune. Is interesting because it is a bit of a shapeshifter. I think it's a few days of just kind of losing our bearing. Not that we've ever had it for many of us, but we do lose our bearing a bit. I'm going to move me to the other side of the screen again so that we can see the dates here. On March 30th, Mars trine Saturn. This is an important one. This is a date to mark your calendars and to do something that has real world meaning. We get something done. This is a work day, and it's not just a day. We'll be feeling this really once Mars moves into Cancer. It'll just be 2.5 degrees orb for its trine to Saturn at 2.5 degrees of Pisces. So the point here is that once we hit this last week of March, it's not time to run off into the future and to start doing things because Mars is in Cancer. But it's all those things that we've been trying to get done and trying to attend to. This is a brilliant time to tie up as many loose ends in our life as possible, even though everything is moving forward. And again, although I didn't say it earlier, Uranus is the last planet to turn direction by the end of January. All the planets, all the traditional planets are in fact moving direct. So the Mars trine Saturn is significant. The Mars square Chiron, not necessarily huge, but we can look for a couple of days of kind of dealing with old issues again, or thinking about what it is we need to learn that perhaps we haven't learned yet. When Mars sextiles Uranus on April 29th, again, a couple days going into it and a day or so after, this is exciting. This is about getting something done, but it's not about the routine of buckling under and taking the responsibility and doing what we have to. This is about doing something exciting. This is about breaking loose. This is about breaking through. And interestingly, Mars kind of stays active through the middle of May when it forms a trine with Neptune. Remember, it squared Neptune back in March. When it trines Neptune in mid-May, we're actually able to make a dream come true. We're able to act on a fantasy or on an idea that maybe hadn't been manifest. And we have to be careful about saying illusions are false. Illusions are the way in which we build reality onto our dreams. We have an illusion. It's neither true nor false. It's just something that we make up. It's imagination. And dreams can come true. In fact, the most important things we do in our lives are often Neptunian in origin because they start off with a fantasy, a dream, an illusion that we then bring in Saturn and we bring in Mars to make it real. So here, as Mars trine Saturn, we have some energy to realize our dreams mid-May. By a few days later, we have Mars moving into Leo. Mars likes being in Leo because it's fire and fire, but it can be a bit stubborn in Leo because Leo is really about intention. And because Pluto is dancing back and forth right on that line between Capricorn and Aquarius, as Mars moves from Cancer, opposite Capricorn, into Leo, opposite Aquarius, we will have Mars opposed Pluto. And although Mars likes being in Leo, this is going to be an interesting few days. We might find ourselves engaged in a very deep and powerful struggle that is not just about a simple ego skirmish. This is not about something about you like red, I like green, let's duke it out. This is something that's deep and powerful. We may see this reflected in the geopolitical scene, but this can be a tough couple of days, especially because Jupiter is in that mix, because that Jupiter is also moving out of its square to Pluto, and by May 22nd, Mars will square Pluto after it has opposed. I'm sorry, it'll square Jupiter after it opposed Pluto. And this just leads me to believe that that whole period of May 20 through the end of May, that things can get out of hand, that there just can be too much of whatever it is that's going on. Because remember, Jupiter is the magnifying lens. And although more of something better is good, too much is not necessarily better. So that's what's happening there. By the way, by the end of June, that Mars will square Uranus. This is a bit upsetting and exciting. One person will love this, another person won't. But if you're willing to go with the change, this can be absolutely awakening and opening. This can be a very powerful shift. But the danger here is holding on to what's familiar. By mid-July, Mars, July 10th, moves into Virgo. As it moves into Virgo, it will oppose Saturn. This brings into a period of time toward the middle end of July, of where Mars is saying yes and Saturn is saying no, where Mars is saying do it, Saturn saying don't do it. We may feel this in relationships. We may feel this with external responsibilities put on us. Blue Celine said Mars is aggression and war. It is, but Mars is also about defending our territories in a healthy manner. So Mars, when aberrated, is certainly aggressive, but when useful is simply assertive. So we have to be careful about slipping into that negativity of Mars, although when it opposes Saturn, we may see some of that play out around us, whether we're part of it or not. I'm going to move through these a bit quicker. August 1st, Mars will trine Jupiter. Get outside, do something. This is like an externalizing, powerful. It's definitely a yang energy. In fact, that maintains its position all the way through the middle of August when it trines Uranus again. This is about breakthrough that is easier than holding on to the past. I sometimes think of that Mars trining Uranus as being on a tightrope and someone saying, how easy is it to fall? Well, it's easy. And if you're prepared, you can land with your feet on the ground. And so that Mars trine Uranus basically says there is going to be a shift, be ready for it. And there's a hexagram in the I Ching that says the ridgepole sags to the breaking point. It furthers the great man to have somewhere to go. What that means is that something's ready to snap. And that if you're paying attention, that's okay. Something needs to break, something needs to give. And as long as you have somewhere that you're ready to go somehow, how you're going to respond to it, it's cool. By the end of August, Mars will oppose Neptune and trine Pluto. I think this is a smoother energy, although its opposition to Neptune can be a period of time where we can be either inspired by someone else's imagination or deluded by them. The advantage here, though, is that it's trining Pluto at the same time, so we perhaps have that ability to get underneath the surface of this to be able to make a good decision. By the end of August, the 27th, Mars moves into Libra. It's relatively quiet there until mid-Libra. Toward the end of Libra, it squares Pluto that has backed up into Capricorn. This can be a throwback to what was going on when Mars opposed Pluto back here on May 20th. It brings that same energy, conflictive energy, out into the open. October 11th, Mars moves into Scorpio. Scorpio is Mars's other home outside of Aries. And when it trines Saturn again, as it did earlier, this is a very powerful time to get stuff done. This is a great period of time to work hard to make things happen. Mars opposes Jupiter. We can overdo it. In fact, this whole period of time of October and into the middle of November, Mars is going to oppose Jupiter, oppose Uranus, and trine Neptune, which is certainly, again, that expansive energy. By around Thanksgiving time in the United States, the end of November, Mars moves into Sagittarius. And the upside of that is we're on an adventure. We're ready to go. We got something in mind. We're ready to go there. The downside is that we can somehow miss the shadow. We can miss the idea that there's something that is a little bit darker and deeper here, because Mars in Sagittarius is not ready to stop to analyze what's in the dark. It's ready to head toward whatever the light is. Mars, as it moves into Sagittarius, will also square Saturn, which has retrograded back to the beginning of Pisces. And then by the end of the year, it will square Neptune. And this can be, again, for the next time, this is a repeat aspect. We can be a little bit mixed up here, but it's probably a good way to bring in a new year. It can be a time to party. So that's basically Mars. Now, I want to talk about Venus for a moment. Venus, I was going to say Venus holds a special place for me, but I think probably Venus holds a special place for pretty much everyone. I mean, Venus is what we like. It's what we're attracted to. Venus goes around the sun in 224 and a half days. 224 and a half days. The Earth goes around the sun in 365 and a quarter days, about. 365 and a quarter divided by 224 and a half is 1.62. 1.62 is rounded off, and that would be the golden mean or the divine proportion, 1.61803339 ad infinitum. And the golden mean or the divine proportion is that perfect spiral of the nautilus shell. It's the magic of aesthetic perfection. The golden mean is also the origin of the Fibonacci number series, and the Fibonacci number series tied to the Da Vinci Code and Leonardo da Vinci and the artists of the Renaissance, kind of creating this drive to find aesthetic perfection, where they used this 1.62 ratio in all their drawings, in the Mona Lisa, Albrecht Dührer's portraits of Jesus, and so on, all had the magic of this ratio of 1.62. And that's the ratio, that's the hum that Venus makes to Earth. And so Venus, as the driver of our sense of aesthetic perfection, of beauty, of love, becomes very, very significant. And because Venus is inside the Earth, it has a retrograde period. It's a very, very weird retrograde period. By the way, someone said they'd never heard this before. I'm going to delve into this very deeply in the course that I'm doing for the Astrology Hub, that enrollment will open on January 26th. Actually, if you go to astrologyhub.com/F3 for Foundations Level 3, astrologyhub.com/F3, I'm doing a 6-week course that you can do at your own pace on harmonic aspects. The reason why I'm even going down this rabbit hole at all here is that because Venus is the golden mean or the divine proportion, as Johannes Kepler called it, to Earth, and the only way geometrically to create this number that never ends, this 1.6180 ... The only way to create it, and the Greeks knew this and did it, was with a compass and a straight edge to create a 5-pointed star. Because when you create a 5-pointed star, the lines of the star divide each and every one of the other lines into a shorter and longer segment, and that segment is this divine proportion. What this means is the five-pointed star is the source and the origin geometrically, sacred geometry of the golden mean or the divine proportion, which is why when Venus makes its station 5 times every 8 years, which are Fibonacci numbers. And if I'm going too fast here, I'm going to cover this in one entire lesson in the harmonic aspects course for Astrology Hub. But the Fibonacci numbers, you go 1 + 1 = 2, and then you keep adding the one behind it. 2 + 1 = 3. 3 + 2 is 5. 5 + 3 is 8. 8 + 5 is 13, and so on, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, and so on. 5 and 8 are Fibonacci numbers. And the fact that Venus lines up with the Earth from the sun's point of view 5 times every 8 years is significant, because over 5 times of doing this, those conjunctions create a 5-pointed star in the sky. Now, we moderners refer to this to this point as the Venus star point, and I don't want to go further into this right now, other than noting that Venus makes its entire retrograde in Leo. Now, Venus in Leo can be a magnificent thing to behold. Why? Because Leo is the summer sun. It's on stage. It's here it is, here I am, here are the flowers in full bloom. And so this idea of Venus being in Leo, normally Venus moves through a sign in, I don't know, about 6 weeks, something like that, 5 weeks. I may be off a week there, but the point is that when Venus makes its station, like Mars, it spends an extraordinary amount of time in that one sign. And so we have Venus hanging out in Leo for a couple of months, and its entire retrograde is in Leo. And so we're going to have a summer that is brilliant, that if we can focus on Venus, it'll be very healthy and very powerful, but every planet has its shadow side. And in Leo, the downside of Venus is the insecurity of needing attention. Love me, love me. You know, I don't love myself, so I need that from the outside. So it's something to be careful about, or at least be aware of. Someone's noted that Rick and Amanda, that would be me and Amanda Pua Walsh, the founder of Astrology Hub, did an episode a few years back on the Venus Fibonacci concept too. You can find it on YouTube. They're all on YouTube. All right, so the fact that Venus makes this station and it's direct, I'm sorry, that it's retrograde in July and doesn't turn direct. It's retrograde for the end of July, all of August, and the first few days of September. I need to just do a very, very quick retrograde disclaimer or reclaimer, because so many people get so bummed out and crazy about planets turning retrograde. There's nothing unnatural about a retrograde. There's nothing bad about it. We make them bad because we have trouble integrating the energy. Everything that you've heard from traditional astrology needs to be revisited from a standpoint of of what we understand about the dynamics of the solar system. Planets are retrograde when they're closer to Earth than they are at other times in their cycle. Mercury 3 times a year comes between the Earth, catches up and comes between the Earth and the sun. That's when it goes retrograde. Venus catches up to the Earth and it goes between the Earth and the sun. It's close to the Earth, and it's that loss of perspective that makes it look retrograde. The outer planets, when they're opposed the sun, they're on the same side of the sun now as the Earth, but the Earth is in between them. The sun is on one side and the outer planet is on the other. So Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron and Eris all go retrograde when they're on the same side or closer to Earth. Think of the planets like broadcast stations, like radio stations. When a radio station is nearby, it comes in stronger. A retrograde Mercury is not negative, it's just loud. And often its loudness makes it so that we don't know how to integrate it. We don't have communication lines that are solid enough to handle the heavy traffic on the bridge or the traffic on the freeway. And we get gridlock, or something happens and the bridge breaks, or the wires fray. And so the thing about Mercury retrograde, and all retrogrades, Mercury just most noticeable because it moves the fastest. So when it stops and goes retrograde by our vision, by appearance, it changes the fastest. When Pluto goes retrograde or direct when it stations, it spends a month in the same degree. Mars actually was at 8 degrees of Gemini on January 1st, 2023. And it'll still be at 8 degrees of Gemini on January 24th. So it's not even moved 1 degree, even though it's stationed direct on January 12th. But Mars is moving relatively fast compared to a slower moving planet like Pluto and so on. But it's the Venus in particular and Mercury that people get freaked out about, because they think they have to go back in time. They have to, and there is this sense of it feeling like it's not covering new territory. And there is a feeling sometimes of like Groundhog Day, that we get an opportunity to clean up material that we had not finished working out yet. It's true that when Mercury and Venus and Mars go retrograde, often events or people or situations from our past return. They just pop back up. But also, the frustration can occur if, let's say, during this Venus station, we're starting a new relationship and we're pushing it ahead as far and as fast as we can. We're going to run into a problem because that Venus retrograde is saying, whoa, 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 just slow it down, internalize it. Be aware of the subtlety of what's happening, because if you can internalize this and become more aware of it, then when that Venus turns direct in September, you'll be able to ride that really powerfully forward. And the same is true with the Mercury retrogrades. And incidentally, Mercury retrogrades, like the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle, follow an elemental theme. And this year, in 2023, it's an unusual year because we have the tail end of a Mercury retrograde at the beginning of the year, and the very beginning of the next retrograde at the end of the year. So it's almost like we have 4 retrogrades in 2023 instead of 3, but it's just because it falls on the calendar that they overlap at the very beginning and the very end. Now, the important thing to understand is that all the retrogrades in 2023 occur in Earth signs. Now, the third and final one does back all the way up into fire. It backs up into Sagittarius, but the retrogrades all begin in Earth signs. The one that we just came out of was in Capricorn. The one from April 21st to May 14th is in Taurus. That's wholly contained in Earth sign Taurus. And so the 5 to 15 degrees of Taurus is the shadow. This is a pretty narrow shadow. The variety of the lengths of Mercury retrograde and the width of its shadow is an interesting thing. I don't want to talk about that right now. But this is a very narrow shadow of 10 degrees. And then the next full retrograde in 2023 is in Virgo, and that's from 8 to 21 degrees. And notice that this is actually wider than 10 degrees. That would be if from 8 to 18. So this is a 13-degree shadow, which is a bit wider. But again, we're focusing on Earth. And then the third and final retrograde, which doesn't end until January 1st of 2024. But this also is a wider, this is 14 degrees. And this is also in Earth. So remember, during these retrograde periods and the period that we're coming out of right now, which is even more powerful because it's combined with a Mars retrograde, incidentally, we'll get the end of August through the beginning of September. We will have both Mercury and Venus retrograde at the same time here. If you remember, we'll go back a slide, that Venus is retrograde all of August for the entire month and into the first few days of September, which means that that Venus will have already been retrograde. Mars will be moving through its shadow most of that month. And so even though Venus is in Leo, and even though Mercury is in its domicile, its secondary domicile on Gemini and Virgo, even though it's at home in Virgo, we're going to have a double whammy here. So we'll need to pay attention to that. Okay, that covers the retrogrades. I want to now take a back up and take a longer view, because 2023 is definitely a turning point year. For the first time in a while, we are free of outer planet. I'm going to move myself over to here so that, again, it doesn't mess up everything else here. For the first time in several years, we don't have major outer planet activity. However, we do have major planets changing signs, and that will continue over the years ahead. We have Saturn moving into Aries in 2025, temporarily, and then permanently into 2026. By the way, this is a view that is available in SolarFire. It's called Time Map, and it just gives you whatever the planet is and whatever aspects you've selected. I've selected here just conjunction squares, oppositions, and trines to Saturn and outward, and ingresses. So we can see that 2028, Saturn will move into Taurus. 2030, Saturn will move into Gemini in May. Some of the dates here overlap, but you can see that in 2028, we're going to have a Saturn square Pluto. This is going to be a throwback to the Saturn conjunct Pluto in January of 2020. So we might look here at this period of time when Saturn squares Pluto 3 times. First time in June, the second time you can't really read that date, but it looks like it might be December, the end of 2028. And then the third time toward the beginning of 2029, about, looks like it's March 29th. The specific dates today don't matter, but the fact that by 2028 that Saturn is going to be trining Pluto, Saturn is going to be squaring Pluto, is very important, because that is a dynamic energy that we're going to have to deal with. That's the first strong Saturn aspect and the first strong Saturn-Pluto aspect since the Saturn conjoining Pluto and squaring Uranus in 2020, 2021, 22. And incidentally, I've spoken about this many times before, but I consider a lot of astrologers looked at the Saturn square Uranus that was in 2021 3 times, and then in 2022 it was almost exact, and it was a culprit during the election process and the eclipse on election day in the United States of November of 2022. People look at that Saturn-Uranus square as one event in 2021 into 2022, and they look at the Saturn conjoining Pluto in January of 2020 as separate events. I don't. They're part of the same scenario, and the scenario is a larger square between Uranus and Pluto, which technically occurred 7 times between 2012 and 2015. And although that seems to be way in the past now, if you think of that very, very powerful Uranus-Pluto square of 2012 to 2015 that impacted the entire 2020s, just like the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of 1965-66 impacted the entire 60s and even into the early 70s. So if you think of that Uranus-Pluto square, what happened was that Saturn came across that square by conjoining Pluto and squaring Uranus in one sweep, even though the square was already wider by the time that Saturn came through. It was like Saturn crystallized that energy. We're now through that. That's a thing of the past. And so the Saturn square Pluto in 2028 is the first hard aspect that we'll run into with Saturn. That Saturn will then trine Pluto in 2031. And although there are the dates here for you to look at and absorb at your own leisure, we're not going to go much further with that, other than to note that Saturn will move into Gemini. And we'll get to Uranus a moment, because Uranus moves into Gemini also. And therefore, Saturn will catch up to Uranus in Gemini in 2032. And that will be a hugely significant period of time. When we look at Uranus over the next few years, and this is actually Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Again, I seem to be in the way wherever I moved myself. I'm going to move myself to there. All right, now, here we have a couple of things to note that are incredibly important to understand the 2020s. First of all, Uranus moves into Gemini in 2025, temporarily in the summer of 2025, back into Taurus, and then finally into Gemini in 2026. It's been noted by several astrologers, in particular, that when Uranus moves into Gemini, where it was when the United States was founded, meaning it was the Revolutionary War, the United States seems to be involved in a war. Now, the truth of the matter is, look, let's tell it like it is. The United States is a warring country. We're always involved in a war, or whether it's covert or overt, whether we can see it or not. We are involved in a war. But the Uranus moving into Gemini corresponded with the American Revolution, with the Civil War, and with World War II, all Uranus in Gemini. So we might keep our ears and senses perked for Uranus moving into Gemini again in the mid 2020s. But here's the magical thing, and we'll return to this in depth in just a moment. And that is between 2026, July of 2026, and we're going to look at that chart in a moment, through the spring of 2028, Uranus trines Pluto 5 times. Now, remember, it was the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 1960s that created the 1960s. It was the Uranus-Pluto square of the 2020s that created the dynamic changes of the 2020s, including, we could make the parallels from the 1960s to the 2020s when we look at drug use, personal drug use in the 1960s with the legalization, first medicalization and then recreational legalization in the 2020s, in the 20-teens, actually, is really where I was meaning, the 20-teens into the 2020s. We can look at the feminine movement and the rise of feminism, Ms. Magazine, and all of those things in the 1960s compared to the gender equality in the and also the resistance to it. Let's not forget that that's there. In the 20-teens, that included the legalization of gay marriage and just the rise of that culture of the transgender and just that coming into such an awareness that even though it had been around, it was never it hadn't flourished as much as it is now. We look at the same with the environmental movement, with the civil rights of the 1960s, and again in the 20 teens. Not that it ever went away, but it's back in our face in a whole new way during that Uranus-Pluto square. The environmental movement, just demonstrations on the streets in the 1960s all around the world, in the 20 teens with the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street, and again, all over the world. Why I'm mentioning this is that in 2026 to 2028, we're going to get that Uranus trining Pluto. The last time that occurred was in the 1920s, the roaring 20s. And it wasn't like everything was perfect, but it sure seemed for the people that were riding that wave, it was a party time. And again, that doesn't mean I mean, every time has its shadow, but we can look from this the stress and the dynamic changes that we've been facing with the Uranus-Pluto square, and then the Saturn squaring Uranus. This is in the 20 teens through 2022. By Uranus trining Pluto 2026 through 2028, I think we'll see some real integration. The other, and I say integration, I don't mean racial integration. I mean integration of all these opposites, the bolt into the future Uranus and the deepening of the energy and that coming out into the open. The other thing that occurs in 2025 into early 26 is that Neptune, which has been in Pisces seemingly forever, for about a decade and a half, Neptune moves into Aries first in 2025, back into Pisces by October, and then it moves into Aries and stays there for 14, 15 years from 2026 through nearly into 2038. I think it moves into Taurus. Yeah. So about 13, 14 years. This is also going to be a huge impact. And that's all I want to say about Neptune. It's a little bit premature to talk about how important it will be when it moves into Aries. And then, of course, we have the Pluto in Aquarius, which we've talked about earlier. It will move into Aquarius on March 23rd, back into Capricorn on June 23rd, back into Aries in late January. I've been saying February, but that's when it's really there, late January 24th. It touches back into Capricorn just barely in 2024, and then it moves into Aquarius by the end of 2024 and then stays there for nearly 20 years. So this is the outer planet layout. And I really think the thing that we're looking forward to astrologically is this period of time here where Uranus is trining Pluto, coming into preparing us for the Saturn squaring Pluto in 2028 and 29. Those are the main events as I see it looking forward. Now, I said I would come back to this chart, and I will. And this is the chart of July 17th, 2026. I've looked at a lot of charts in my life, and this is really an intriguing chart. We're going to just spend here, we're going to spend a few minutes here, but I want you to notice that this is the first date of the exact 5 times of the Uranus trining Pluto. Uranus trining Pluto. Look at Neptune. It's within 7 minutes of arc. That's like almost 1/10 of a degree at the midpoint of that Uranus-Pluto trine, meaning that Neptune is exactly sextile to Pluto on one side and sextile to Uranus on the other. And if that's not enough, we have Jupiter, even though it's no longer partile, it's in 3 degrees rather than 4 degrees Uranus, 4 degrees Neptune, and 4 degrees Pluto, but it's at 3 degrees and 54 minutes. I mean, this is like nearly there. It's just, I mean, it's within a half a degree of trining Neptune, and it's within 2/3 of a degree of opposing Pluto and sextiling Uranus. This is unbelievable. I've never seen a chart with the outer planets in such resonance. And again, we have to be careful about the trines are good, sextiles are good, squares are bad, because this can be a solidifying of the status quo, whether the status quo at that point in time is good or bad. So it's really important here. This is a moment that we get to exercise our free will in a way that I think can be very important. Whether we actually get to manifest it or not is revealed in the next chart or two, which I'm going to take us to. Now, this is a chart of the exact same moment. And the chart here is with the Uranus, in particular, the Uranus trine Pluto. But we have here a golden yod, which again, these are harmonic aspects, not traditional zodiac aspects, but in no way are they minor or less important, in no way. And as someone who has been using these harmonic aspects for 40 years, I can tell you that I would just as soon do a chart without Mars as do it without quintiles or septiles. That's how important they are. I mean, if you're going to eliminate an aspect, eliminate sextiles before you eliminate quintiles. Not that you should eliminate either. But anyhow, what I'm pointing out here is that Venus, Pluto, and Saturn are on 3 points of a 5-pointed star. Remember that 5-pointed star we talked about that Venus makes? Well, this is like a yod, but a yod would normally have a 60-degree base. That's a sextile, and a 150-degree arm. Those are quincunxes. But we widen that base from 60 to 72, and we get 3 points on a 5-pointed star. There's a missing point down here in late Gemini and a missing point up here, probably in late Scorpio or early Sag, somewhere up there. These are incredibly powerful signatures. I mean, these golden yods occur in charts like Albert Einstein, like Mozart, like William Blake, like Sigmund Freud. They're not always positive. They're in charts like Adolf Hitler, and but the point here is that these are a natural expression of something that didn't exist before. And because Venus is at the apex or the manifestation point here, and Saturn and Pluto are driving the base, I think this is incredibly important. The Venus to Saturn is only a half a degree of orb. It's 35 minutes of orb. The Venus to Pluto is a degree and a quarter. For orbs on quintiles, I use 5 degrees. I think that, and again, I'll talk about this in the Harmonic Aspects Workshop and Astrology Hub. But for now, just let it suffice for me to say that even the Saturn to Pluto is less than 2 degrees. This is an important configuration, and this is occurring this very same day. And on top of that, we also have these septiles, which are 1/7 of a circle. Unlike the quintiles, which are natural and beautiful and fit into the 3-dimensional world, even though they seem magical and soulful, septiles are aliens. They're otherworldly. And the septile patterns and weight here, again, are extraordinary. Just the amount of septile energy, again, Venus being involved, the Venus to Mercury is 4 minutes of orb. That's 1/20th of a degree, Venus to Mercury. And then the Venus to Neptune is still only about a half a degree orb. And then that's the Venus to Neptune. And the Mercury to Neptune is also a half a degree orb. This triangle here with Venus, Mercury, and Neptune is incredibly powerful, but also the Sun to Uranus is less than a half a degree orb. Now, septiles are otherworldly. One of the most heavily septile charts I've ever seen was the first bombing of the World Trade Tower. Now, again, we have to be careful about the good or bad judgment. What's good for one person is not necessarily good for another. What's bad for one person is not bad for another. In fact, there's a wonderful book by Nick Collerstrom about the aha experience, where he analyzes 10 timed significant aha breakthroughs in science, and septiles are predominantly active, as are they in UFO sightings and abductions. There's been work done where the connection to ET and aliens with septiles is very strong, very powerful. But Dane Rudhyar called the septile the aspect of fate. To me, there is a fateful aspect because something comes through from another dimension. It's like it's way stronger, way more powerful. You know, we have things that we do every day. One day we do it and everything changes suddenly. That's a septile. It's Uranian in a way, because it's like something happens out of the blue. And people's charts who are very strongly septiled have a very definite signature of being aliens. It's like they strike out of the blue. David Bowie just comes to mind as a really strongly septile chart. I mean, you know, you talk about alienation, he was an alien. He was a spaceman. So this moment in time, this first of these 5 trines here are with all the aspects in it. You can kind of just see it's an extraordinary moment. I don't want to belabor it more. I just want you to be aware that I think that looking ahead, that July of 2026 is going to be a major, major cultural transition point. The last of the 5 exact trines, the first one was at 4.5 degrees of Gemini and Aquarius. And the final one will be at 8 degrees 50 minutes, Gemini and Aquarius. But look at this pile up now in Gemini, and look at not only the trine from Uranus to Pluto, but Mercury is in that mix also. And also keep in mind that we have a very intense square energy. Remember, this is coming into the period of time where Saturn will be squaring Pluto. And so it's almost like we move from this crazy futuristic, everything changes, into this dynamic of where we have to make these new boundaries work. And that may take some doing, especially with the Mars squaring Pluto, Chiron coming into squaring Pluto, and Saturn coming into squaring Pluto. So that's it there. I want to now back up. Keith said sex on the tiles. Well, that reminds me of one of the times I did this lecture on harmonic astrologers. I called the title of the lecture was The X-Tiles. The Truth is Out There. And I talked about the X-Tiles being the sextiles, the quintiles, the septiles, the biseptiles, triseptiles, noviles, the turnstiles, the kitchen tiles, the infant tiles, the reptiles. They're all tiles. There are all kinds of tiles out there. Anyhow, I want to back off just a little bit now and just look at this from a global point of view, or from a more philosophical point of view, because we've taken an overview of what's going to happen mechanically, astrologically in 2023. But we can't predict an event. As Rick Tarnas says, you know, these events are mechanically knowable, but they're multivalent. The archetypes can express in many different ways. And often when an astrologer predicts the future, it's my contention that the astrology can get you to the archetype. But when an astrologer makes a very specific prediction, they're what they're doing is they're popping the quantum wave function. They're taking this field of indeterminacy, and again, like lightning, they're turning the waveform into a point. And when we do this, we actually participate in making it happen. And I think we have to be careful about over prediction, because when many people believe the same thing is going to happen, chances are it can happen. And in fact, when we look at our own charts and we start worrying about some event in the future, the worrying about that event is actually the thing that can actually create it to manifest. You know, it's said that what we resist will persist. And in fact, you know, or where attention goes, energy flows. And so this idea that when we look ahead, we need to practice this kind of Zen Tao. The energy will flow as it flows, and we can make little adjustments to it along the way. This is what yoga is really about. It's not just sitting in a posture until you're exhausted. It's taking an attitude and exploring it. And in fact, the word asana actually means attitude, kind of like the sailing concept of the verticality of a mast of a sail is called its attitude. How far do you lean into that blowing wind to get power or direction? And so in a way, when we do asanas, we're assuming attitudes. We're changing how we're meeting the energy. Is the future predictable? I'm not sure it is, but it is changeable. And the way in which we change the future is not by changing the future. I know that sounds counter logical. The way we change the future is by changing the past. And now people go, no, you can't change the past. The past has already happened. It's occurred. Well, has it? I mean, for my friends here in the United States, think about, or anywhere, think about your view of the past about things like Columbus's discovery of America. When I was a youth, we learned, wow, that was magnificent. We discovered a whole new world. We created a whole new world. We learned that Thanksgiving was this amazing time, when we honored and gave thanks to the Native Americans, the indigenous people who helped us. And it turns out that these things are fictions, that we didn't discover the new world. It was doing fine without Europe here. We conquered it, we colonized it, but that's a very different perspective. We changed the past. When we think about Thanksgiving and we realize that we've basically eliminated, we performed genocide on an entire continent of indigenous peoples. We didn't thank them, we killed them. And, and I'm talking here in stark contrast, but the same thing happens individually, which is why we go to therapy. We go to therapy so we can change our future by recreating the falsehoods that we have about our past. So we have more choices in the present moment because we change our view of the world in the present moment to open up possibilities that we didn't know exist. The Buddhists would tell us that the only thing we can change is awareness. And that's the power of astrology, is being able to focus our awareness on things that we didn't previously know exist, that we previously didn't know existed. So is the future changeable? Yes, but it's more fixed than the past. And the way in which we change the future is by recreating or revisioning or correcting our past to give us more changes and more options in the present, which then alters our trajectory into the future. Thoreau wrote in Walden, "Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. I drink at it, but while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. It's thin. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. I would drink deeper, fish in the sky whose bottom is pebbly with stars. I cannot count one. I know not the first letter of the alphabet. I have always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born." This is a beautiful statement that it reminds me of Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, where he goes through various stages in his life, from a wealthy prince who doesn't know their suffering to someone who engages that, to someone who becomes enlightened, first becomes a businessman, then becomes enlightened, and then ends his life as a ferryman. And he talks about the river as being a metaphor, because you can cross that river, you can go in the river, but it's the same place, but it's never the same river. It's almost like we don't flow through time. We're stationary. We hold our nodes, our knots. I mean, node is Latin for knot. Bucky Fuller used to do this demonstration where we'd have two people on stage hold a 20 or 30-foot long piece of rope that would be tied together, so there was maybe a 3 or 4 section of manila and a 3 or 4 section of like yellow polyethylene, and then a section of jute, and then a select section of nylon, and there's all these different colored ropes, and he would tie a large overhand knot in it, and he would work, and he would have two people holding the rope, and he would work the knot down the rope, and the color and the substance of the knot changed, but the shape of the knot stays the same. Our individual natal horoscopes show us the shape of the knot, and time runs through us like a river running through it. Time runs through us, and the shape of the knot gets pulled and stretched and bent out of shape, but the knot always is trying to return homeostatically to its own position. The shape of the chart shows us the patterns in which light has crisscrossed itself and tied itself into nodes or knots, and those knots actually slow down light enough so that it impinges upon our sensory organs so that we perceive solidity. There's nothing solid in the world. The world is vibration. But when vibrations intersect with each other, like the moon's vibration around the Earth's vibration around the sun, that creates the nodes of the moon. Nodes are created when vibrations intersect. So just an aside here to change our thinking about these views of when we look into the future or the distant future. I came across this. I don't know who the author is, but it said, how to stop time, kiss. How to travel in time, read. How to escape time, through music. How to feel time, write. How to release time, breathe. Some people, it seems like wherever I move myself, I'm always in the way. Story of ego. We're always in the way. Let's get over here. All right. Some people create their own storms and then complain when it rains. This is so true. I mean, look, I'm not saying that difficult things don't happen to us, whether or not we create them. The three-dimensional world can be difficult. However, we need to be aware, and astrology can help us gain awareness over which of the storms that we are complaining about or experiencing are storms that we created. Catherine the Great wrote, "A great wind is blowing, and that either gives you," let me do that again. "A great wind is blowing, and that gives you either imagination or a headache." You know, the future is there. The future is going to move toward us as it always does. The past is going to appear to move away from us as it always does. As we move toward the future, or as the future moves towards us, we're either going to be freaked out by it and get a headache, or we're going to use it to expand our imagination and grow. And as always, I'd like to end with think cosmically, because the further out we can think, the more into the macrocosm we can go, the more our mind stretches outward, the more we also go inward, because the inward and the outward are reflections of one another. The cosmic doesn't create the local. The cosmic doesn't, the planets don't make us do anything. What happens on the inside and what happens on the outside are in fact reflections of one another. Think cosmically, act locally. Here's contact information for me. Again, I'm in my own way. I'll move me over to here. And I'm going to take a look at questions, see what's cooking there. I'd be happy to address some. I'm sorry that I can't go through all of the chat. I will do that later, but I'm um, yeah, Lynn, you could turn off your chat, and I'm sorry that I didn't see that until just now. I'm just going to look at some questions here. Yeah, Jupiter's direct turn on the same degree of the eclipse. You know, I never really quite said this, but although I look at eclipses, I've never seen them have the same impact that other astrologers note. And I'm not saying they're unimportant. I'm just saying we tend to focus on different things. And I look back at 2022 and look at the eclipses. And to me, I mean, the eclipse on election day in the United States was powerful, but election day would have been powerful anyhow, but it was certainly an important one. The other three eclipses, you know, you can interpret them. You can interpret any moment in time. And again, I'm not trying to discourage you. And in fact, we did spend time looking at them. And yeah, I would say that Jupiter's station around the same degree as the eclipse, you know, can be significant. What is its significance? I don't know. It would have something to do with putting additional importance onto this particular Jupiter direct motion at that moment in time. And again, yes, I will make this available on YouTube. I will publish this publicly. If you're signed up to my YouTube channel, if you're subscribed to it, the channel is Rick Levine Astrologer. If you subscribe and hit the bell for notifications, you'll be notified. I don't come out with that many public videos. You won't be overwhelmed. Normally it's the once a month video, occasionally a mid-month video, and occasionally a special video like this. On the other hand, if you're not subscribed, but you do look at my monthly forecasts, I will put the link to this YouTube in my February monthly forecast, which is only 10 days away. So I'll make sure that you all have the link to this. In addition, I will also put this on a shareable Google Drive, and I will publish that address also, so that you have the ability to get to the actual slide deck without me bothering you with my words. If you just want, you know, to be able to get the dates on some of these events and so on. Someone asked if I'm still accepting requests for chart readings. Embarrassingly, the person said I signed up about a year ago. Yes, I'm still accepting them, and I don't know if I'll ever catch up. Here's what you do: if you've sent me an email already, you're in the list. You're in the line. I have not been working away at this too much in the past year because I've been so distracted with writing and teaching. I do expect to get back to consultations more. I will work my way down that list. If you're interested in a reading, send me an email to this link here, to the rlevine@stariq.com. And whether or not I respond to you right away, you will be in the list and you will be on my mailing list for that. When it comes up, you'll it's definitely a way to get a hold of me. Put in the subject chart reading. That does help. All right, let me just see if there's any other questions here. What orb do you use for septiles? I'm going to cover this in absolute depth. There'll be four lessons out of 16 lessons on septiles in the harmonic in the harmonic aspects level 3, foundations level 3 course through Astrology Hub. The simple thing is this, and I'm going to do this very quickly. If you don't get it, take the course and take the slow version through this. Aspects and harmonics are the same thing. A conjunction is the first harmonic. An opposition, you divide the circle by 2. That's the second harmonic. A trine, you divide the circle by 3. That's the third harmonic. A square, you divide the circle by 4. That's the fourth harmonic. A quintile, you divide the circle by 5. That's the fifth harmonic. A sextile by 6, the sixth harmonic. The septile series by 7, seventh harmonic. The octile or semi-sesqui-squares are the 8th harmonic. The 9 or the noviles are the 9th harmonic. The deciles, the 10th harmonic. the 11s, I call the 11 tiles, or the unguentines are the 11th harmonic, and the 12th come up with the zodiac signs. They're the 12th harmonic. The rule in physics is very simple. The lower the harmonic, the louder the note. In music, the same thing. And what that means is that as you go up in harmonics, your orbs should get tighter. What that means is that whatever orb you're using for the 6th harmonic, sextile, whatever orb you're using for the 4th harmonic, the square, the quintile should be in between. Now, I use about 8 degrees max orb on a square, and I use about 5. I use about 5 degrees on the I'm sorry, I use about 8 degrees on the square and about 3 degrees on a sextile. So I use 5 degrees on a quintile. Some people say that's crazy, it's a minor aspect. I would say if you go fishing and you use a net with very large holes in the net, you'll never know that anchovies exist. You got to use a net small enough to catch that particular fish. So I use 5 degrees on quintiles and biquintiles. Septiles, which is the 7th harmonic. What orb do you use for sextiles? Again, I use, 3 typically. For the quincunxes and semisextiles, I might use 2 or 3. So I would use, for my septiles, 7th harmonic, I use 2.5, 3 degrees. It's, again, they're not minor aspects unless you treat them like minor aspects. And in the course, I'll make a very strong case for how these hidden or metaphysical or non-zodiacal aspects are actually part of the recovery of the feminine aspects of astrology. That squares, 90-degree angles, are masculine. It's the cross of the church. It's the material reality. And that the Venus pattern for example, the quintiles, the golden mean, the septiles, these fall through the physical cracks, and so they help us recover parts of the universe that previously were dark matter, shadow, unconscious. We didn't know they were there. So they're not minor. So that's what I use there. Okay. Someone wrote, thanks. I've heard you mention writing a book on quantum astrology. We're looking at a release date of 2024. A lot of the work has been done and there's still a lot to go. So that will be in some ways a compendium of maybe the basic work that I've been doing for at least 35 years. I began writing a column called Quantum Astrology in 1992, a quarterly column for what was then Aspects magazine. For the Foundations 3 course, and again, that's astrologyhub.com/F3. I'll put that in the chat box also. Just bear with me here a second. It's astrology.com/F3 for Foundations Level 3. There is no prerequisite. I mean, if you were able to hang on to most of this talk, you'll be fine there. Levels 1 and 2 are certainly useful, but if you know the planet signs and houses to some extent and the major aspects, you'll be fine. And the way the course is that there'll be 16 pre-recorded lessons. And you can watch them at your leisure. You can go over them as often as you want. They'll be your property, accessible online. And then there'll be 2 live sessions, one in which we'll do live charts of people in the course looking at their harmonic aspects, and then another live question and answer at the end of the course. And that is astrologyhub.com/F3. All right, let's just see if there's anything else. And the chat with the recording. Yeah, I'll make the chat, Patricia, available. The chats often to me seem noisy, but I'll make the entire chat available. I'll publish a link in the comments on the YouTube when that is published. Someone asks, is it more important if Pluto is transiting the descendant or opposing the ascendant repeatedly? Well, whenever Pluto goes over a point multiple times, the real planets can go over a point 3 times, but they don't have to. Like Saturn, you can have a Saturn return or a Saturn transit that occurs once, or you can have a Saturn transit that occurs once, then a retrograde twice, and then direct 3 times. With Neptune and Pluto, and Eris, they move slow enough that the retrogrades can cover the same territory so that you can get 5 hits, 3 of which will be direct and 2 retrograde, but you can get 5 exact hits on a Pluto or Neptune transit. When you get the multiple hits, there are people who go, oh, you lucked out. You only had one. I had it 5 times, or I had it 3 times. The fact of the matter is, I think that the transits are often more difficult to integrate when they happen fast one time round compared to when we have maybe 3 times over a Saturn transit, 7, 8, 9 months to integrate it and to move with the process. That's a good question, and that's a superficial answer. The kids who are starting 6th grade in March of they will be the ones graduating in 2026. What do you think about this generation? I think that the kids who will be graduating high school in 2026 will live in a world that will be alien to us now, even though we think we're so amazing with our use of Zoom and Google and application software and amazing computers and graphics and all this stuff. I mean, astrology calculation software and so on. But culture is going to hit the fan, kind of like the shit hitting the fan. It's going to hit the fan of artificial intelligence. And most of us, even if we've done research into this, don't really understand what artificial intelligence really means. Artificial intelligence is not Google, answering our questions. I'm going to take off my screen share. This my changing shadow is distracting, and let's see if I can do this. Well, it doesn't seem to let me do. Oh, here we go. There we go. All right, here I am for real. I think this artificial intelligence thing is so beyond what any of us can possibly imagine, and I think that this is really important because because what's going to be out there is smarter than we are. You can already have artificial intelligence in 3 seconds write a term paper giving it information. In fact, I saw a talk recently by a gentleman who said, write me a paper on the difference between the ideas proposed by Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and write it in the form of the King James Bible. 3 seconds, boom, there it was. And then he had this same artificial intelligence system evaluated as if you were a professor in college to give it a grade and to critique it. I mean, sorry, but we don't know what's around the bend. Everything's going to change. Education will change. There are people who are saying that colleges and universities will become a thing of the past. They will just fall into history. I don't know. I do know that with Pluto moving into Aquarius and eventually Neptune moving into Aries, that we're on a rocket ship that feels like it's already launched, but we've been in a latent period where things have been gathering and we are not yet on the launch pad. That's really all I can say there. If I'm not still around in 2026, I hope to come back quickly. I'm not someone who wants off the wheel. There's a lot of work to be done here on Earth, and I'm coming back as quickly as I can. Online programs that show septiles. I'm not sure whether Astro.com does that. I know they show quintiles. I believe they're now showing septiles. I'm not sure. Um, the answer is I don't know. I use SolarFire. SolarFire does, obviously. Kepler software does. You know, David Cochran, the author of the Kepler software, he's as much as a harmonic geek as I am. He calls the astrology that he does vibrational astrology. I call what I do, I think, sometimes harmonic or quantum astrology, but we're in the same realm of practice. And that is that planets are not just points in space, they're not just rocks, they're not just particles, that the universe is particle wave. And although the planets are, I call them BFPs, big fucking particles, they're huge particles, but they're also waveforms, and therefore they vibrate. They just vibrate very, very, very low frequency. And David's work in vibrational astrology, I think, is incredibly important. And it's basically barking up the same harmonic or vibrational tree that my work is. Okay. Someone says, what's the update on the Pluto return theory that I presented in the Astrology Hub? You know, as long as I've been doing astrology, it's like the many-headed Hydra. I mean, I began doing astrology in my late teens. I'm 73. That's, 50 years, 50 some odd years, 55 years. I have more questions now than I did when I first learned my sun sign. And one of the questions I have has to do with the difference between sidereal, used in Vedic astrology mostly, and tropical. In tropical astrology, we're considering the wobble of the earth, and I don't want to go deeply into this, but the point is that the zodiac actually slips backwards 1 degree every 72 years. That's what makes the changing of the ages over 2,176 years, or whatever that number is, 2,200 years, just over 2,000 years. But we might not notice that, in 20 or 30 or 40 years, but it makes a difference to 1 whole degree in 72 years. What that means is that on my birthday, when I'm 72 years old, the sun in my chart will be 1 degree away from where the sun is against the actual stars in the sky. Now, I'm not interested in shifting gears and using sidereal astrology to map a birth chart, but I am intrigued by the fact that Saturn doesn't complete an orbit at our Saturn return. It completes a tropical orbit, meaning that it appears to be completing an orbit. It's slipped 1/2 of a degree, roughly, in 30 years. When it comes to the United States Pluto return, Pluto doesn't return. NASA tells us that Pluto takes 248 years to complete an orbit. Well, you can do the math. The United States was founded, the birth chart is 1776. 1776 plus 248 is 2024. Is that right? Yeah. We're only in 2023. We're a full year away from Pluto completing an orbit. However, it's returned to where it was in its tropical chart. And many people say, well, that's it. That's the Pluto return. And I get it. And certainly we're in that process. Stuff is happening. But I wonder what will happen when Pluto actually does complete its full orbit, 1 complete orbit around the sun, rather than an apparent orbit. And this is the difference between looking at the sky as to how we see it geocentrically and looking at the sky as it really is. So that's the difference there. Will Rob Hand update planets and transits to include septiles, quintiles? The answer is no. Rob has kind of slipped off the grid. When I spoke with him last, he was nearly complete with his update, complete rewrite to planet and transits, which did now include quincunxes and also included Chiron. Now, that's all I know. My observation, though, just as a point, and again, I'll dig into this a lot deeper in the harmonic aspects class. My sense is that transiting harmonic aspects aren't always as obvious as transiting squares. And the reason makes a lot of sense. And that is that squares and oppositions and conjunctions and half squares and square and a halves, they all have to do with the material universe. They have to do with the apparent three-dimensional world. Quintiles and subtiles are more metaphysical. Now they can both manifest, but they need squares and hard aspects to angle off of to pop something into reality. When I wrote a daily column for 20 years, and I didn't use septiles and quintiles much. Occasionally, there would be a day where there would be so much septile energy, I would remark on it in that way. But normally, the louder aspects that infringe upon the material world, the conjunction squares, oppositions, quincunxes, even trines and sextiles, which more maintain the status quo, they're more obvious. In my client work, I'll look at transiting quintiles and subtiles, but often they play a secondary role. They're more about the internal landscape. However, in a natal chart, that changes. They're overwhelmingly obvious, powerful, and dynamic. Joanne asks about houses. I don't care what house cusp system you use. I would only caution you from putting too much weight on house rulerships. If you're using whole sign houses, that kind of sidesteps the issue, because the whole sign rulership really works, that's sign oriented. It's not really house oriented, although the houses become the artifact. Regardless of that, if you're using quadrant houses, whether it's Regiomontanus, Marinus, Placidus, Porphyry, Coke, Campanus, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It doesn't matter. They're all arbitrary. Every one of them is limited because they're all trying to squeeze a complex, multidimensional thing onto a flat piece of paper. None of them work. And what that means is that if you're using a ruler to a house cusp and you change your house cusp system, there's always going to be an astrologer out there smarter than you or smarter than me who uses a different house cusp system. I know astrologers who say, in order to do this technique, you have to use Regiomontanus. In order to use that technique, you have to use Marinus, and so on. And change your house cusp system and your house rulers can change. So I use houses. They are significant, but I give the cusps a fair amount of slack. I look at natural house rulers, whole sign rulers in my head, and I'll also look at where they're bent out of shape. But I remember I taught in Norway, in Oslo, a number of years ago. And the first client I had said, by the way, when you do my chart, you're going to notice that my ascendant is conjunct my midheaven. There's nothing wrong with your software. And But if you think about it, there are places on the planet as you get closer to the poles, North Pole in particular, because there's no one living close to the South Pole that we know of, that what happens is the houses get so bent out of shape because the sun never rises. If the sun never rises, what's the ascendant? The ascendant is where the sun rises. And then there are times when the sun never sets. Where's the descendant? That's where the sun sets. So whole sign houses certainly have their use in that area. So I don't care what house cusp system you use, as long as you inside somewhere acknowledge that whatever system you're using isn't right, as I acknowledge what I use isn't right. And the reason we use different house cusp systems is typically because our teacher used it, or someone we really respect uses it, or we like our chart better using it, which is really when people say it works better, they mean I like my chart better. My reason for using Coke is just as stupid as anyone else's reason for using whatever house cusp system they use. I use it because it's the only one that was created in the 20th century. And I like to think of myself as a modernist. Dumb reason. All right. Someone said class is full. I don't know what that means, Blue. Tell me what that means. And explain the difference between Saturn alone and versus with Neptune. I think when you have a planet that's a slow moving planet like Pisces at home in Neptune, or like we had Pluto in Capricorn, everything else that moves into that sign becomes part of its, I don't want to say servant, but it is in some way serving this deeper, larger cause or master. And I think that when Neptune shifts into Aries, that Pisces will be relieved of its overinflated importance of fake everything, fake news, of illusions, of imagination, and that will strive towards getting a new clarity. Someone said that that the self will be more involved in, our understanding of what's real. Perhaps, I don't know. We'll see how that goes. No, if you go to that F3 link, Marcella, and you put on the wait list, click that, it will then allow you to click through that and then actually register. If you can't do that, you will get a notification. Open registration happens next week. So you will get, the class is not closed. You will be allowed to register. But even if you get to that page, the /F3 page, and click on the wait list, that just captures your email address and so on. It then takes you to the registration page. If you choose not to register, at least that way you'll be notified when registration opens, but you can register. And that is not an open link for everyone else. That's just for my patrons and YouTube subscribers. So there. And yes, Anne Marie said that if you're on my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Rick Levine. If you're a Patreon supporter of mine, or if you're in the Astrology Hub inner circle, don't register until you have the discount code. My patrons already have that discount code. I'm not going to give it out here because not everyone here is a patron. And if you're in the inner circle, you don't have that discount code yet, but you will get it. Wait to register until you have that discount code. It is 20% off. Okay, let me get back to the questions and answers. And we're pushing 2.5 hours. So we're going to bring this to a close here pretty quickly. Thanks for the avalanche of wisdom, Rick. Can you share your approach to yads, how to read them? The answer is yes, but not here. And I'm not playing hard to get at all. I'll delve into these more in the harmonic class, because we'll be talking about quintile yads, septile yads, and octile yad, sometimes known as Thor's hammer. A yad is an isosceles triangle. The traditional quincunx yad, I do have a course on quincunxes, or a workshop on Astrology Hub, and it's something that I talk about a lot in both my chart web interpretations for patrons and in my other work, but it's just too much to go into here. Yads are important. In fact, any bilaterally symmetrical aspect configuration is important. A T-square, in my mind, is like a yad that's been flattened out. A yad traditionally is a 12th harmonic pattern with a sextile, 2/6 at a base, and the two sides of the isosceles triangle, quincunxes, that's 5/12. So it's a 12th harmonic aspect. And they are incredibly powerful. I have a very close quincunx in my chart, and I can talk about it more than you'd want, but it's not for here and now. Quincunxes are an important aspect. They're an aspect that Ptolemy said did not matter. Traditionalists, actually, true traditionalists, do not use the semisextile and quincunx. The semisextile is 1/12 of a circle. That's if they're in a sign next door. And a quincunx is 5/12 of a circle. That's one sign next door to the opposition. Ptolemy said those were inconjuncts. They couldn't see each other. They had no relationship. For Ptolemy, that made sense, because the lens he was looking at was the 12-fold lens of the zodiac. And I think it's important always to remember that there are not 12 signs up there. There are not 12 signs up there. There are 12 signs in here. We made this shit up. And we made it up for a good reason, and it's useful and it works. But there are not 12 signs up there. There are 12 signs in here. And we could just as well have made 4 signs. Oh, we did, the elements, or 3 signs, the modalities, or 5 signs, the Chinese elements. I mean, we could take any number. It's just that 12 is magical and convenient, but it's not, we can't be limited to it. And 12 also leans very heavily on the patriarchal, 3-dimensional material universe of cause and effect, the Aristotelian, this is what it is universe, whereas the other aspects do not. Okay, rabbit hole I don't want to go down to any further. I think that's enough for now. Thank you all for, so many of you stuck this out. I know this was long. I know it was involved. You will be able to rewatch it. And just thank you so much for your appreciation. And thank you for those of you who are patrons. You make this work possible, that I can put the time and effort into this to share with you. Thank you again and again and again. You're my lifeline, and I appreciate you. And happy new moon. Happy new moon in Aquarius. Happy year of the water rabbit. And I will see you all in the future, wherever that future may take us. Think cosmically, act locally. I'm Rick Levine, out for now.